Good morning. The committee meets today to discuss the final report of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, or NDS. The NDS Commission was established in the fiscal year 2022 National Defense Authorization Act with the mandate of assessing the 2022 NDS and the Department's efforts to successfully implement it. During today's hearing, the committee will receive the Commission's evaluation of the national security challenges we face, whether the force planning construct in the 2022 NDS remains valid, and the effectiveness of the Defense Department's implementation of the NDS. The commission was chaired by the Honorable Jane Harman, who served 9 terms in Congress as the U.S. Representative from California's 36th Congressional District, and was ranking member of the Intelligence Committee for 4 years after 9/11. The commission's vice chair, Ambassador Eric Edelman, is currently counselor at the Center for Strategy and Budgetary Assessments and served previously as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2005 to 2009 and as U.S. Ambassador to Finland and Turkey. And really want to commend the Commission for the extraordinary work you've done. Very, very proud of your effort, and I know it was an intense work over many, many months, so thank you very, very much. I'm pleased, of course, to welcome the chair and vice chair, but I also want to congratulate their fellow commissioners, General Jack Keane, Thomas Mankin, Mara Rudman, Maria Sixkiller, Elisa Staszak, and Roger Zakheim. Together, you did a remarkable job. The 2022 National Defense Strategy was written prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the evolution of the strategic partnership between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Nonetheless, the 2022 NDS provides an important framework for America's national security. The NDS ranks China as the most consequential strategic competitor, identifies Russia as an acute threat, and addresses the persistent challenges from authoritarian regimes and violent extremists. Indeed, I believe that we currently face the most dangerous, complex security environment since World War II. To address these challenges, the NDS proposes 4 broad missions for the Department of Defense, which include defending the U.S. homeland, deterring strategic attacks against the United States and its allies and partners, deterring aggression while being prepared to prevail in a conflict, and building a resilient joint force and defense ecosystem. The NDS also outlines several priorities for building joint capabilities, including the concept of integrated deterrence, campaigning, and actions that will build enduring advantages. And these are well-reasoned priorities. I understand that the NDS Commission agrees broadly with these objectives, but has concluded that the Department of Defense is not adapting at the speed or scale necessary to achieve them or meet today's threats. The Commission recommends a fundamental change in the way we approach our national defense, including an overhaul of the Defense Department's relationships with the U.S. interagency and our allies, a significant investment in the defense industrial base, and a restructuring of the Department's acquisition and procurement process. I look forward to hearing the Commission's specific recommendations on how to make targeted investments and reforms in these areas. Notably, the Commission concludes that the 2022 NDS does not provide an adequate force structure to handle simultaneous conflicts in multiple theaters. The Commission proposes a multiple theater force construct that would resize and restructure the joint force to match regional threats and integrate with regional allies. I would appreciate our witnesses further explaining this construct and what challenges the departments may face in implementing it. At its core, the 2022 NDS requires all elements of national power, including military, diplomatic, and economic, to maintain a stable and open international system. However, the Commission concludes that America's civil society must also be reinvigorated as a source of national power. The American public must be educated on the threats we face and encouraged to engage in national service, whether through the military or civil service. And I support the Commission's urgent call to engage more in this area. Ultimately, the 2022 NDS recognizes that the U.S. must modernize and strengthen our military. This will require smart investments in platforms and equipment, rapid development and integration of cutting-edge technologies, and steadfast support for our service members and national security workforce. I will welcome the Commission's insights on how the Department is adapting to these complicated issues and the challenges of great power competition. In light of the wide-ranging global security challenges presented by Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific region, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the persistent terrorist threat posed by extremist groups and rogue regimes, the Committee would appreciate the Commission's assessment of the resources necessary to prevail in strategic competition, as well as its recommendations for strengthening U.S. global engagement and alliances. Let me again thank the members and staff of the Commission. We look forward to your testimony. Before recognizing Senator Wicker, we have a quorum, and I would like to proceed with your permission. Since the quorum is not present, I ask the committee to consider a list of 3,135 pending military nominations and 2 civilian nominations. First, I ask the committee to consider a list of 3,135 pending military nominations. All of these nominations have been for the committee the required length of time. Is there a motion to favorably report this list of 3,135 pending military nominations to the Senate?
Moved.
Is there a second? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
The motion carries. Finally, I ask the committee to consider the following civilian nominations. Ms. Tonya P. Wilkinson to be Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, and Dr. Michael L. Solmeyer to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. Is there a motion to favorably report these 2 nominations? Is there a second? Second. All in favor say aye.
Aye. The
motion carries. Thank you very, very much. Senator Wicker, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to congratulate you on a very fine opening statement, which I fully subscribe to. We have 2 very distinguished witnesses today, and this may possibly be the most important hearing we will have this year. But I have to say I very much appreciate the service of Representative Harman and Ambassador Edelman. Let's go back 6 years. This committee began holding hearings on the first National Defense Strategy Commission report, which reviewed the 2018 National Defense Strategy. The first NDS report was important, helped us make significant bipartisan progress toward improving our national defense. We lost Chairman Jim Inhofe just a few weeks ago. Many of us will remember that he in particular admired that report. He would often hold the report up and wave it around at hearings. His enthusiasm proved that the NDS served as a guiding light for him, and it prompted all of us to consider the report's recommendations. The global security environment has worsened much faster than we expected back in 2018. The first line of a new 2024 NDS Commission report summarizes the situation in which we find ourselves. I will quote that line. The threats the United States faces are the most serious and most challenging the nation has encountered since 1945 and include the potential for near-term major war, unquote. A dramatic and forceful statement. It turns out that the Commission believes that we are not at all where we need to be. And I think members of the committee understand this. We understand clearly there's no time to waste. The Commission report notes that our military capacity and capabilities are insufficient to meet the current requirements at acceptable risk. The document details the way in which the 2022 National Defense Strategy and assessment completed just 2 years ago did not adequately account for the threat of simultaneous and increasingly coordinated military action by our 4 primary adversaries, a group which I have come to call the axis of aggressors. The report correctly notes that with the possible exception of the Department of Defense, the U.S. government is not acting with alacrity or making so-called whole-of-government strategies more than simply a buzzword. It aptly describes our hollow, brittle defense industrial base and painfully Byzantine bureaucratic process. The report also finds that we cannot fix these problems without increasing defense spending. Thankfully, this committee has added a $25 billion top line increase for the fiscal year 2025 NDAA. Even that increase, a 3.8% nominal addition, would fall short of the Commission's recommendation, fall well short. The report endorses a 3 to 5% real increase this year, with inflation running above 2%. I appreciate the Commission's recommendation that national security spending must return to late Cold War levels, a goal which matches my plan to spend 5% eventually of GDP on defense. That level of investment would be temporary. It would be a down payment on the rebuilding of our national defense tools for a generation, tools that, if sharpened, can reduce the risk that our adversaries will use military force against U.S. interests. Peace through strength. The 2018 and 2022 defense strategies both recommended a vague force sizing requirement. The mandate called for the U.S. military to have sufficient forces to defeat either China or Russia in a major conflict while simultaneously deterring other adversaries. That force sizing construct failed to provide a useful measuring stick by which to determine the ideal size and capability of the U.S. military. I would appreciate the commissioners expanding upon their new force sizing construct, which proposes that we be able to lead coalitions that can defeat both China and Russia while continuing to maintain deterrence elsewhere. I would also like our witnesses to explain a claim they make in the report. The document contends that the American public does not appreciate the threat environment and therefore does not understand why a strong defense is necessary to ensure a bright future for our country. Very perceptive. This is a perspective that echoes concerns expressed by the recent Congressional Strategic Posture Commission. I'm of the opinion that this is largely the fault of the U.S. government, the executive and legislative branches alike, for failing to make the case to the American people. Mr. Chairman, I could go on and on. I would simply say that I appreciate a great deal of the Commission report. I'm grateful for the work of all 8 bipartisan commissioners and their staff. Thank you for calling each and every name of the commissioners, and I hope their labor can help guide us as we write a new national defense strategy and the legislation that will follow to allow us to regain our military edge and avoid wars in the years to come. Again, Mr. Chairman, I congratulate you on your opening statement, and I subscribe to it, and I yield back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Wicker. Now let me recognize Chairwoman Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to appear before you, Ranking Member Wicker, and so many other members of this committee whom I serve with in the House and who are very good friends. I'm happy to be back. And as you know, Mr. Chairman, I almost wasn't back today because yesterday afternoon at Boston Children's Hospital, my youngest child, a daughter, had very experimental surgery, which has resulted, we hope, in her fetus becoming healthy, and hopefully she will give birth in a few weeks, and it's quite a miracle. And obviously I was going to stay there if things had not gone well. But I mention this not only because it's top of mind, but also because it makes clear how amazing this country is and how important what we offer in terms of health care and other services and benefits to the American people is. And it's worth fighting for this country. And that's what our report is about. We try to make the case about how it is worth fighting for our country. And some pundits have already said, well, it's a good report, but it'll gather dust on shelves. I sure hope not. Our commission on a bipartisan basis was unanimous in our recommendations, and we are dedicated to making sure they get implemented. And I just suggest to you, and I listened to your opening statements, I think you're dedicated on a bipartisan basis to making that happen too. So let's not waste a minute. In that vein, Eric Edelman, our vice chair, who co-chaired the last commission, is sitting next to me, and I will yield to him in just a moment, but let me make a few points. Our commissioners who are sitting on a bipartisan basis right over there have been introduced, Tom Enck and Mara Rudman and Roger Zackheim, but you did not introduce the vaunted staff sitting behind me on a bipartisan basis, ably led by David Granis, whom you may know was the chief of staff to the late Dianne Feinstein for many years here, and who was originally hired by me in my capacity as a member of the House. You've mentioned when the NDS was written, you've mentioned when we were created, but I'll just underscore again that we think, and you said it too, that the threats to U.S. national security and our interests are greater than any time since World War II and more complex than any threats during the Cold War. Significant and urgent action is needed. We recommend fundamental change in the way the Pentagon and other government agencies do business, the way they incorporate private sector technology, and a full embrace of our partners and allies. Shorthand for this is we recommend using all elements of national power. Our report includes actionable recommendations, which we will highlight in just a moment, including one that is being implemented today, and that is telling the public how grave the threats are. Sadly, we think, and I'm sure you agree, that the public has no idea how grave the threats are and is not mobilized to meet them. Public support is critical to implement the changes we need to make. Leaders on both sides of the aisle and across government need to make the case to the public and get their support. Eric.
Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Wicker, and members of the committee, it's a pleasure to be back before you again. I think this is the 11th time I've testified in front of this committee. And I do want to say one thing, which we could not have come to a unanimous bipartisan conclusion of this report without the leadership of our chair, Jane Harman, who worked indefatigably to get us there. These are difficult issues that we wrestled with and which you wrestle with every day. But I really want to just commend Jane for the leadership she demonstrated in leading our commission. Several of our commissioners served on the 2018 commission, and General Jack Keane, who's not able to be with us today, actually served with me on the 2010 commission. The 2010 commission said that we were facing a train wreck because threats were gathering, but defense resources were declining. In the 2014 National Defense Panel, we said that the Budget Control Act had been a strategic misstep, that it hampered U.S. defenses, and that we needed to go back to threat-based defense budgeting, as Secretary Gates had last done before the BCA in his FY11 budget. And last time we raised the question of whether the United States might find itself in a conflict it could lose if current trends continued. 6 years later, when we came back to this task, the threats are more serious, and we found that we as a nation have failed to keep pace. As you said, Chairman Reed, and as Secretary Gates has said in an important article he wrote in Foreign Affairs, this is the most challenging global security environment since the Second World War. There is potential for near-term war and a potential that we might lose such a conflict. The partnership that's emerged among China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea is a major strategic shift that we have not completely accounted for in our defense planning. It makes each of those countries potentially stronger militarily, economically, and diplomatically, and potentially can weaken the tools we have at our disposal to deal with them. And it makes it more likely that a future conflict, for instance in the Indo-Pacific, would expand across other theaters, and that we would find ourselves in a global war that is on the scale of the Second World War. The 2022 NDS identified China as the pacing challenge. We found that China is in many ways outpacing the US. While we still have the strongest military in the world with the farthest global reach, when we get to 1,000 miles of China's shore, we start to lose our military dominance and could find ourselves on the losing end of a conflict. China's cyber capabilities, space assets, growing strategic forces, and fully modernized conventional forces are designed to keep us from engaging in the Taiwan Strait or the South or East China Seas. China has been testified to before Congress, has infiltrated our critical infrastructure networks to prevent or deter U.S. action by contesting our logistics, disrupting American power and water, and otherwise removing the sanctuary of the homeland that we have long enjoyed. For its part, Russia has reconstituted its own defense industrial base after its invasion of Ukraine much more rapidly than people anticipated. Vladimir Putin seeks to reassert Russia as a great power and is happy to destabilize the world in order to do so. Our report describes the threats posed by Iran, North Korea, and terrorism as well. Clearly, Iran and North Korea both feel emboldened by the current environment, and terrorism remains a potent threat fueled by the proliferation of technology. As the DNI has said, the current war in the Middle East is likely to have a generational impact on terrorism. We share the goal, I think, as a commission unanimously of the NDS, that our purpose is to deter war. But doing so is going to require moving with a greater sense of urgency and determination beyond what we've seen over the last couple of decades.
Mr. Chairman, we're at 10 minutes and happy to submit the rest of our testimony if you prefer and take questions, or we can briefly summarize our findings. Which would be better?
I think the Vice Chair and I would like you to go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're sharing this. First finding, DOD cannot and should not provide for the national defense by itself. The NDS calls for an integrated deterrence that is not reflected in practice today. A truly all elements of national power approach is required to coordinate and leverage resources across DOD, the rest of the executive branch, the private sector, civil society, and U.S. allies and partners. We agree with the NDS on the importance of allies, and we commend the administration for expanding and strengthening NATO and building up relationships and capabilities across Asia. We also point out ways for the United States to be better partners ourselves, including by maintaining a more stable presence globally and in key organizations like NATO. We call for reducing barriers to intelligence sharing, joint production, and military exports so we can better support and prepare to fight with our closest allies. Second recommendation is fundamental shifts in threats and technology require fundamental change in how DOD functions. This is particularly true of how DOD works with the tech sector, where most of our innovation happens. We say that DOD is operating at the speed of bureaucracy when the threat is approaching wartime urgency. DOD's structure is optimized for research and development for exquisite, irreplaceable platforms when the future is autonomy, AI, and large numbers of cheaper and attritable systems. I know this because I represented the Aerospace Center of Los Angeles in Congress for so many years, where exquisite, irreplaceable satellite platforms were built. And now we know that there is a plethora of commercial platforms that can do many of the same things and offer redundancy. DoD programs like Replicator and the Defense Innovation Unit and the Office of Strategic Capital are great, but they're essentially efforts to work around the larger Pentagon system. In addition, since the 2018 report, the Joint Staff has worked to develop operational concepts to overcome deficits in numbers and geography. Our commission finds that there is more work to be done to truly operate a joint force with technological and strategic advantage.
Mr. Wicker, you raised the issue of the force sizing construct in your opening statement, and we, as you noted, found that it is inadequate. I mean, it was written actually before the invasion of Ukraine and before the emergence of this tightening alliance between Russia and China. And we propose that the force needs to be sized, the joint force, in conjunction with U.S. allies and partners to defend the homeland, but simultaneously be able to deal with threats in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. These are not all the same fight, so different elements of the force would be required in different parts of the globe, but U.S. global responsibilities require a global military response as well as a diplomatic and economic one. President Putin, in some ways, has done us a bit of a favor by having invaded Ukraine and exposed, as a result, some of the limitations of U.S. defense industrial production, and shown that it's grossly inadequate to provide the equipment, technology, and munitions that the U.S. military and our allies and partners need today, let alone given the demands of a potential future conflict, which might be even more taxing. The DoD workforce and the all-volunteer force provide us with a kind of unmatched advantage, but recruiting failures have shrunk the force and have raised serious questions about the sustainability of the all-volunteer force in peacetime, let alone if we had to mobilize for a major conflict or a protracted conflict. The civilian workforce at DoD and in the private sector also face critical shortfalls, and we can discuss some of that later in the hearing.
A few more findings. We found that the joint force is at the breaking point of maintaining readiness today. Adding more burden without adding resources to rebuild readiness will cause it to break. And secondly, we found that the United States must spend more, but also spend better. This is a point we make consistently. It's not just more legacy programs. It's more spending that gets us to the ability to deter and win future wars. Additionally, we think that Congress should revoke the 2023 spending caps and provide real growth. I know Senator Wicker loves this one, for fiscal year 2025 defense and non-defense national security spending that at a bare minimum falls within the range recommended by the 2018 NDS Commission. That range was never achieved. Subsequent budgets will require spending that puts defense and other components of national security, other components, jointly across government and the tech sector and partners and allies, other components on a glide path to support efforts commensurate with the U.S. national effort seen during the Cold War. But we agree, and let me underscore this because some of the commentary about our report has missed this. We agree on a unanimous basis that the national debt is its own national security challenge. If we want to approach Cold War levels of spending, we need to increase resources and reform entitlement spending. During the Cold War, top marginal income tax rates were above 70% and corporate tax rates averaged 50%. We don't call for those numbers, but we are calling for an increase in resources and point out that interest on the debt is higher than our total number of our total top line of defense spending. So, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wicker, and many good friends on this important committee, we thank you for your role in establishing our commission, and we're happy to share our report with you, and we welcome the opportunity to answer questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chairwoman Harman and Vice Chair Edelman, for your impressive and sobering testimony. Just to reiterate, you've said it several times, but it's important to note, is that our funding, it can't be exclusive to the Department of Defense. We have to look at the Department of Treasury, Department of State. You even indicate the Department of Education because of the shortfalls we're seeing in recruitment, which can be traced back to very poor education and very poor public health, obesity. Just again, Representative Harman, Ambassador Edelman, your comments on that.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely. All elements of national power. The U.S. needs to project power across our government, leverage the enormous talent and innovation of the tech sector, connect both of those to partners and allies, and then we have impressive deterrence and in the kind of integrated deterrence that the NDS, the 2022 NDS calls for that has never been achieved.
Thank you. When I was in the service a long, long time ago, the stock phrase was shoot, move, and communicate. Now I believe the phrase is communicate so that you can shoot and move. One of the key elements, I think, is we have tried, but we're not there yet, with a communication system that reaches every aspect of our military, which is uninterruptible and which is dependable. Ambassador Edelman, your thoughts on that issue?
No, I very much agree with that, and that, of course, what the Joint All-Domain Command and Control System is meant to address. But as you say in your, as you suggested in your question, Chairman Reed, the department's not quite there yet, and we're, of course, it's complicated by the fact that the system is being done by all three services and then has to be brought together and unified. So there's a lot of work to be done on that, and it's one of the areas where we think insufficient progress has been made.
In terms of priority, I would think it'd be very, very high on the list, if not number one. As I said, if you can't communicate, you can't do lots of things. Is that your feeling too?
Yeah, absolutely.
If I could just add one thing to that.
Of course.
We call for interoperability, which has not been achieved across the Pentagon, let alone with other government agencies, let alone with partners and allies. And we make a point that some of our classification systems work against each other in terms of sharing information. And the goal would be to have an effective communication system across all elements of national power.
Thank you. The other, one of the many points, and you've emphasized, and I think importantly so, is we have to engage the American people, not just in getting out the word about the threat, but also getting them involved. And that puts a big emphasis on public service, not just in the military domain, but in civilian public service. And can you just elaborate on those, starting with Chairman Harman?
Well, the notion of public service isn't new, as you know, Mr. Chairman. It's been around for years. It was around when I served in Congress, and Congress did not act on any of the proposals that I saw. It is still a way to get all of the public at the proper age engaged in understanding the requirements of citizenship. A lot of our young people have no earthly idea, sadly, because they have no civic education, what our government really is and what are the ways to serve. And surely one of the most honorable ways to serve is as a member of the military. You did it, and other members of this committee have done this. And I think that is the way to revive a kind of sense of coherence and patriotism that we are lacking right now.
And adding to this, Ambassador Edelman, is the point you make in the report. The size of our military force is too small, and our ability to expand it rapidly is probably very weak. Is that a fair estimate of our situation?
I think that is a fair estimate, Mr. Chairman. We have not really, as a society, talked about the need for national mobilization. But if the worst were to happen, and some of the worst scenarios we discuss in our report were to come to pass, and were we to face a global conflict, it would require mobilization on the scale of what we did as a nation during World War II. And we haven't done that in a long time. We haven't thought about that in a long time. There are a lot of elements to it, including stockpiling strategic materials, but being able to rapidly bring people into the military, et cetera. And I just don't think we're prepared to do it. I think we have to have a national discussion about this. And I think it goes hand in hand with the earlier discussion you had with my colleague about national about public service and serving the nation.
We had in World War II 2 years, essentially from September 1st, 1939 to December 7th, 41, to prepare. And I doubt it will have 2 years to prepare in this environment. Thank you very much. Senator Wicker, please.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony, and again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was a time when we could sort of count on a rivalry between Russia and China. We don't see much of that anymore, and of course, I've spoken of this axis of aggressors. How are they cooperating with each other now? And in a real crisis, what do we need to look out for about increased cooperation among the four countries that I've identified? That includes, of course, Iran and North Korea. Representative Harman.
Well, I think Ambassador Edelman would want to add to this, but I remember being a member of the Defense Policy Board when Jim Mattis was Secretary of Defense, and his piece of advice to us was, let's do everything we can to keep Russia and China apart. Well, oops, that has not happened, and there is this close friendship and collaboration between them. You asked, how is it manifested? Well, we see it most at the moment in Ukraine, where Russia was the aggressor, violating international law and invading Ukraine, and China is a huge help to Russia in evading our sanctions by buying Russian gas and by its efforts to ship into China material for the war. And then you add in, as you mentioned, Iran and North Korea, which are suppliers of drones and other lethal material to Russia. And this unholy alliance, or whatever I think you call it, an alliance of aggression, is extremely dangerous. Let's remember that both North Korea has nuclear weapons, Iran is at breakout for nuclear weapons, and the other two countries are nuclear countries. And where this goes is, it seems to me, terrifying. And that is again why we need to leverage all elements of national power to make sure we deter these countries from acting against us.
Ambassador Edelman, respond as you'd like, but also you might also want to take this question as you speak. Representative Harman mentioned Ukraine. Why is Ukraine important to this entire discussion? And if Ukraine manages to be successful and keep their own borders in their own country, what signal does this send to Xi Jinping?
Thank you, Senator Wicker. I really don't want to add very much to what Representative Harman just said, other than to say, in short, what we're watching is a war of premeditated, unprovoked aggression by Russia that is being financed by China and enabled by its transfer of dual-use goods, including precision tooling that's allowed Russia to get its defense industry up and running despite U.S. sanctions and export controls. Drones provided to Russia, including a factory built in Russia by Iran, and of course millions, literally millions of rounds of 152 ammunition for the Russian military coming from North Korea.
Sir, some people ask, what's that to us? How does that affect the United States and our people?
Well, it affects the outcome, of course, of the fight in Ukraine, which gets to your second question. I mean, first, Ukraine offered to give up, and I was involved in some of the diplomacy of this back in the 90s, the nuclear weapons that were left on its territory after the end of the Soviet Union. As a result of that, Ukraine gave them up, but in exchange for assurances from the United States, Russia, Great Britain, and France that its territorial integrity would be recognized along the border lines that existed before the 2014 seizure of Crimea by Putin, which was a violation of those undertakings. If our assurances in the nonproliferation realm, in this instance, are shown to be hollow. It will raise questions in the minds of all of our allies about the assurances we've given them, our extended deterrent assurances, whether it's for our allies in Europe, part of our multilateral NATO alliance, or our bilateral allies in East Asia, or our partners, parts of special relationships we've developed in the Middle East with Israel, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt and others. So the whole fabric, frankly, of the international order is at risk here, depending on the outcome in Ukraine. And to your point, if Putin is successful in Ukraine, the lesson that Xi Jinping is likely to draw is that he too can be successful in Taiwan or in the East China Sea or the South China Sea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Shaheen, please.
Well, thank you both for your work on this report, and thank you to the other members of the commission, those of you who are here and those who are not. You talked about the communications, the need for interoperability and for communications, but I didn't hear you talk about, and also you talked about an approach that coordinates all elements of national power, but you really didn't talk about the information environment. So can you, one of the areas where we are not keeping up with our adversaries is in the information environment. It's with disinformation, misinformation. So can you talk about what the report suggests we should do with respect to information?
Well, it's a hugely important topic, and you're right, we haven't got there yet, but malign influence, foreign malign influence in our pending election is something that we're all worried about, and it is a security threat. Let's go there. But certainly across the world, foreign malign influence and dis and misinformation can alter how we understand what the threats are against us. This is a huge focus now of our intelligence community, and I'm glad this committee is also paying attention to it. We touch on it, but we really, I'm just looking at Ambassador Edelman, we don't have a focus on that. We do talk about AI, cyber, and the information environment, but we don't specifically address mis and disinformation, and I wish we had paid more attention to that.
Let me just, I remember being in this room, I think, after the KLM airline was shot down over Ukraine, and General Breedlove, who was then CENTCOM commander, saying, as long as it takes us 2 years to identify the Russians as being the people responsible for what happens, we are losing the fight. And I think that's a problem now. I appreciate everything you're saying about legacy systems, but the reality is until we get that information domain into our discussions, we are not winning the fight.
I agree, and we have to attribute where attacks are coming from in real time. It's tricky, for example, in responding to cyber attacks, to know whether if China does something to us or Russia or some criminal syndicate, we should respond immediately, because tit for tat can lead to unwise outcomes for us. But nonetheless, we have to know who did what to us.
And we don't have a strategy. And we are not working. The Global Engagement Center at the State Department, which has that as its goal, is not integrated with what we're doing at DoD. So
we address that. We do say that the State Department, Defense Department have to align their regions of operation with each other, and then add in the Treasury Department with sanctions, add in all the other agencies of government like AID that have some play here, add in partners and allies. That's the way to project American power. And you're right that a huge focus needs to be, absolutely needs to be, on finding the source of dis and misinformation and making sure we correctly understand the threats against us.
Senator Shaheen, if I just might add to what Representative Harman said, part of our emphasis on all elements of national power is precisely to get at the issue you raise, which is that we have disestablished, a number of years ago, the U.S. Information Agency. We don't really have a dedicated capability. We have in the Department of Defense a capability for military information to support operations, which is an important capability, but I think sometimes because there's a default to DoD, they end up engaged in information operations that are really beyond what they're capable of executing effectively, and I think that is a problem. So we need a better integrated effort across the entire panoply of national security institutions, but also need some dedicated effort on information. Our adversaries think information is a hugely important domain. They invest a lot in it, and we just have not matched that investment.
I certainly agree with that. I'm pleased to hear both of you say that. Hopefully that will be more of a focus going forward, and I appreciate the First Amendment concerns. However, we were able to deal with that during the Cold War. We ought to be able to deal with it today. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sheen. Senator Fisher, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Harman, and also Mr. Ambassador, all of the commissioners and good staff for the work you've done here. Mr. Ambassador, nuclear deterrence is the foundation. It is the bedrock on which our national security rests, and I understand that the Commission did not seek to replicate that work that came out of the Strategic Posture Commission, but it does highlight the importance of deterrence, strategic deterrence, in view of China's development, Russia's aggression, on and on. As you considered the strategic elements of the national security policy for us, can you explain to this committee the role that nuclear modernization plays in the NDS Commission's proposed multiple theater force construct?
Nuclear deterrence, Senator Fisher, is is the fundament on which everything else is built in terms of our national security. It's operating every day. It's not visible to American citizens, but the fact of our nuclear deterrent force, all three legs of the triad, being available is the most powerful deterrent that we have to conflict. It's not sufficient, but it is the absolute basis. And we really, I think, agreed with the conclusion our colleagues on the Strategic Posture Commission reached, which is that we have to move forward with alacrity on all the elements of modernization of the nuclear triad. That's the GBSD Sentinel program, that is the B-21, that is the Ohio replacement class. All of those things have to be accomplished, and there are problems in some. One of the reasons we highlighted education is that some of the problems that GBSD are running into has to do with lack of skilled workers to be able to pour the kind of special reinforced concrete that you need for the new silos for missiles, the new control systems for missiles. We lack welders in the submarine industrial base, as Senator Wicker knows well. So there's a lot that has to be done across the board in order to move forward with nuclear modernization, but it is absolutely fundamental to our ability to deter aggression against our allies and, of course, against the homeland.
Thank you. And Representative, I really appreciated your comments on the workforce and the need we have for that, for a national strategy, and to be able to work with Senator King on a bill that we introduced, that we were able to get some of those important factors into the NDAA so that we can address them and hopefully continue to grow what we need and meet those needs quickly. Ambassador, based on the Commission's work, what do you think are the biggest barriers that we are going to face as a country to achieving that multiple theater force construct? And Representative, I'd like to hear your opinion on that as well.
Well, the first, Senator Fisher, to your question, the force right now is too small, and so we have to grow the force, and that's in the face of the recruiting challenges that we've highlighted in the report that the Army in particular, but also the Navy and the Air Force have faced.
And why, and I'm going to interrupt you.
Please.
Why is it too small? Can you explain, in this setting, the threats that we are facing when we look at the adversaries that we face and how that has changed over the last decade?
It's too small in part because the department was sizing itself for one conflict. But if you have to be present in 3 theaters, as we are now, we've got conflicts in 2 theaters now. If we have a third conflict in a third theater, it's going to require, a lot more forces. People talk, for instance, about the Indo-Pacific being largely a Navy and Air Force fight. That's correct, but the logistics that support the Navy and the Air Force will largely be manned by the Army, and so we have to have an Army that is sufficiently large that it can operate in all of these places potentially simultaneously. Because honestly, it is very hard to imagine today a conflict in the Indo-Pacific that doesn't become a global conflict very quickly. Someone asked earlier in the hearing about cooperation between Russia and China. The last time I testified before this committee was 2 years ago about the so-called 3-body problem, Russia, China being both nuclear peers of the United States. And one of the criticisms that was leveled at my colleague Frank Miller and me was that, well, there's no evidence that Russia and China are collaborating in the nuclear area. Well, we just saw them flying strategic bombers together, up near Alaska. So, I don't know what more evidence you want that they're beginning to collaborate in that strategic area.
If I could just add a few things. First of all, on the nuclear triad and the nuclear posture review, Senator Kyle is a dear friend of ours. He did great service in the Senate and writing that report. And we talked about whether we should, in some ways, overlap some of his recommendations, but we decided they were so good they should stand alone. So it's not that we don't care, it's just that we recognize good work. And add to that, though, that our nuclear agreements that were so important over recent years, especially the heroic work that President Reagan did, don't include China. And a number of them have lapsed, and that is a truly dangerous situation, especially when rogue states like North Korea and Iran are part of the nuclear game now, and there could be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East or in Asia also. So just would point that out. In terms of workforce and why is it small? Well, one thing we have not done, and we mentioned this, is embrace the tech sector adequately. Future wars are not going to be fought the old way with vulnerable big platforms. They're going to be fought with more software, less hardware, more software. Not to diminish hardware, but we need both. In fact, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was at the Aspen Security Forum last week. Some of us were there. Senator Sullivan was there. And he said, DOD is not a hardware department. Right, it's not, or if it is, it should not be a hardware department. So not only do we need more people, but we need different skills. And we need people who understand the tech base. And in fact, we have said that the business model of the Pentagon ought to move to embrace the business model of the tech sector, where failure sometimes is important so that you can improve things. And just want to comment to a prior question, some of us were in Ukraine looking at how they produce goods, including drones and tanks, and they have been much more innovative than we have, and there are lessons to learn there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Rono, please.
Thank you very much, Representative Harman and Ambassador Edelman, and to all of you who worked on this very important review leading to 7 very substantive recommendations, each of which requires some fundamental changes. So as I review your recommendations, and noting that you started off, I believe, by saying that we need to inform the public as to the nature of the dangers that we're facing with the great power competition. And how we're going to do that, I'm not so sure. I am wondering whether your review included the fact that Russia, for example, is not only a great power competition in the military sector, but they are also engaged in our elections and misinformation when we have natural disasters, for example. I don't think very many people know that when Maui had its wildfire, that there were indications that Russia had sent misinformation as to how the wildfire started, and how to question what FEMA was doing. So I'm wondering whether you reviewed all of the different ways that Russia is providing misinformation in a lot of platforms, not just in the military arena. And what can we do? That's one way to inform the public, I would say, to the dangers that we face.
I think the challenge, Senator Hirono, is that Russia is very active in this space, you're correct, and it's an important part, actually, of their military doctrine. And they see information operations as part of a suite of activities, as opposed to being stovepiped between information and other kinds of military operations. And we still, I think, see it in sort of stovepipes. But Russia's not the only challenge. I mean, Iran has been very active in this election cycle with a very different agenda than Russia's, but still interfering in our election. China as well is very active. All of our adversaries are active in this domain, and we need, I think, to take it very, very seriously. And I do think we need to inform the public. That's, I think, a responsibility that the executive branch certainly has, but I think you and your colleagues have a role to play as well.
Well, I think that we are also stovepiped in how we approach the dangers that are presented by China, Russia, Iran, and the other actors in the cyberspace.
Yes.
And so one way that I think that the public will be apprised of the dangers is to inform them of the misinformation, etc., where they can relate, such as our elections, and I don't think we're doing such a great job with that. One of the other important recommendations you made, you talked about, Congressman Harman, is that we are not set up to take risks in our acquisitions and other forms, and that the culture of not wanting to take risks. So how do we even approach something like that? Because it's not just we need to maybe spend more money on our military, but how do we change the culture so it's not just about money, it's about attitudes, it's about risk-taking. How do we approach that?
Well, let me respond to something you started with, which is the devastation in Lahore, Maui. Having been there just before the fire, it was a glorious place, and you lost so much of your history in it. It's tragic that that happened. On this topic, we had a lot of discussion about risk-taking, which is a core value of the tech sector. How do you learn unless you take risk? How does SpaceX learn unless it's prepared to lose a lot of its assets and then build better based on lessons? Sadly, both the Pentagon and Congress are pretty risk averse. I'm not accusing any member of this committee personally. However, the way Congress operates with respect to requirements of the Pentagon, and not only some of the budget issues here, we'll get into those, I'm sure, operating by CR and possible, shutdowns is really an expensive way to proceed. I'm sure you are all aware of that, and hopefully we're in a new era where we don't do that. But if you build to requirements and then the requirement fails and then you do oversight and punish the people who have failed, that creates a risk-averse culture. I'm not saying reward people who have failed, but understand that if we're going to iterate and build better models of, pick anything, drones, tanks, anything you might need in current and future wars, we have to be prepared to fail. And we have to understand that culture. And this committee, by doing multi-year procurements and other things, which we point out would be very helpful, and allowing the Pentagon to change some of its, some of the details of procurements as a routine matter, if that will improve the performance of whatever it's building, would be extremely helpful. So I'm glad you pointed that out. We tried to point it out as well.
Thank you. Senator Rounds, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me begin by thanking both of you and the members of your commission for the work and the service to our country that this provides. Most recently, when Director Haynes and General Cruz were before this committee, I think it was in May, they confirmed that the initiation of hostilities between the United States and either Russia or China would increase the likelihood that hostilities would be initiated by the other against the U.S. as well. It would appear, based on the conversation so far, that your commission would agree with that assessment. Is the department planning for this reality in which conflict with either Russia or China likely means a conflict with both today? Ambassador Edelman?
Well, the department's plans basically, as embodied in the NDS of 2022, like its predecessor in 2018, essentially is geared towards defeating one adversary while holding the others, harmless essentially by nuclear deterrence. What I don't think the department is actually begun to wrap its arms around is precisely the scenario you outlined, where, to give an example, if we got into some kind of conflict in the Indo-Pacific, whether it be over Taiwan or the South China Sea or East China Sea, what might Russia do? One thing that comes to mind is take advantage of the separatist movement in Moldova to move on Moldova, a country that's trying to move closer to the European Union and to the West. Which would then precipitate, additional conflict in Europe, or take advantage of the ethnic Russian-speaking minorities in the Baltic states, say Latvia, to initiate a conflict there. How would we manage that? When you raise that question with department leaders, they basically say, well, that, to go back to the chairman's point earlier, well, that would be sort of like World War II, or would require national mobilization. And that's correct, but we haven't really taken the next steps to really focus on what that and what a protracted conflict would actually look like. We're optimized to fight very short wars.
Representative Harman, I appreciated your comments at the very beginning of this discussion, in which you shared that yesterday your family was challenged and that your daughter was going through some very serious surgery, and this is something that every family can identify with. You also talked about the technologies involved in your decision-making, was that you would stay there if anything serious was still in the air, and I appreciated that, and believe me, this entire committee would have supported you in that decision. You also indicated the need, or what this country represented with regard to the technologies that we have and that we sometimes don't take advantage of. We have that opportunity with this report to talk about those technologies today. There are 5 different domains in which our country will be attacked in the future. Air, land, and sea, most people would understand. But space and cyberspace are the new domains which will precede any attack on the first 3. With regard to cyber, today in the United States, we just recently came through a time period in which an accident occurring by one company literally crippled a significant part of our airline industry. Is it fair to say that both Russia and China have capabilities to do more than simply cripple airline capabilities? And what exactly would that look like for the American people should we have a contest with either one of those two adversaries?
Well, thank you, Senator Rounds, for your personal comments. I really appreciate that, and I hope everyone committee is as fortunate as I was with the news that I got late last night, which enabled me to get on the 6 a.m. plane. On cyber, it's a huge threat, and I don't think we minimize it in any way. One of the things we might anticipate, for example, is if China decides to annex Taiwan, or whatever euphemism they might use, they might engage in a major cyber attack here first, for which we are underprepared. Cyber attack of our infrastructure. When I was in Congress, I represented the Port of Los Angeles, which, with the Port of Long Beach, is the largest container port complex in the country. 50% of our container traffic enters and exits through those ports. There are cranes on the port, surprise, to move the cargo, and those cranes have Chinese technology. So guess what?
All of which are subject to the possibilities of cyber attack.
Absolutely. We should anticipate that our ports could go down.
Throughout our entire society, we find that to be the case, don't we?
I'm agreeing with you. And this is devastating. Does the American public understand this? No. This is our point about public awareness. This is something that's happening right now. If anyone's watching this important hearing, they're learning things that they might not know otherwise. It's an opportunity for leadership to try to educate the public, and thanks to your committee for doing it, about the grave threats we face. So cyber is a huge threat. You also mentioned space, again, something I know something about, since I used to call my district the aerospace center of the universe, where most of our intelligence satellites were made. We are more dependent on space as a country and more vulnerable in space because of that dependency than any other country. And shoring up space, which is one of the threats we address, is absolutely crucial. And it's not just military space, but commercial space. A lot of how you talked about communication, a lot of how we communicate is through commercial space. And think how inconvenienced the public would be if all of a sudden their little devices, which we're all dependent on, didn't work.
Thank you. I'm out of time and overtime. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well said, Senator. Thank you. Senator Kane, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. It's good to be back before you. Ambassador Edelman, 11 times testifying here, and Jane, probably about the equivalent. We should give you guys some steak knives or something. I mean, a very helpful report. Couple of thoughts before I ask some questions. Ambassador Edelman, you mentioned your testimony earlier when you talked about potential for nuclear collaboration between China and Russia. You were kind of criticized for that. And I remember that. And frankly, the Pentagon, during the entire time I've been here, beginning in 2013, when we asked questions about the possibility of cooperation between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, they kind of poo-pooed the idea as if historical enmities or border disputes or the past would block them from being able to work in a collaborative way. And I've always found that dismissive attitude naive. And I think that the results of today are showing the degree to which these nations, seeing the U.S.'s strong alliances, realizing they don't have them, they're drawn closer and closer together. There may be barriers to the level of cooperation, but we shouldn't assume those barriers are going to inhibit significant collaboration. And I think that's one of the aspects of your testimony, your joint testimony in the report, that's very powerful. I did chuckle at one of the punchlines, which is that we need to do a lot more defense spending and bring the deficit down too. We hear that punchline at a lot of hearings in a lot of different committees, but that's why, that's why we get elected to do what we do, and there are tough choices to be made. Here's a question that I have. If you asked American public, and I do think educating the public about the challenge is important. If you said, what's the most important national security threat today? I bet the top one would be fentanyl. I think before just the American public would cite Ukraine or would cite the possibility of a war against Taiwan, I bet they would say fentanyl. The National Defense Strategy in 2022 had one paragraph about the Western Hemisphere. You have a section dealing with Africa and Latin America that is a much longer paragraph. I like that. And yet it's about Africa and Latin America, and it talks about the fact that China and Russia are making Africa and Latin America real centers of activity. And as the chairman of the Americas Subcommittee on Foreign Relations, when I travel in the Americas again and again and again, from governments left, right, center, or unpredictable, what I hear is we'd rather work with you than with China, for example, but you're not present. Yeah, we appreciate you lecturing us not to accept a free 5G system from China, but what do you have on the table? We appreciate you telling us not to allow Russia to help with port investments, but what do you have on the table? And I think the fact that we spend so little intellectual energy focusing on our own hemisphere, and I just match that up against, I think the American public would say fentanyl is like the biggest challenge, national security challenge that they see every day. Now, this committee's done some good work. We have done significant investments in fentanyl interdiction technology. I had a chance to see some of it that is being piloted in Brownsville about 2 weeks ago that I think will really help us. Senator Ernst and I in last year's NDA did a provision that calls for greater mill-to-mill cooperation between the United States and Mexican militaries on the fentanyl issue. But why don't we just spend more energy on the Americas? What blocks us from more focus in the hemisphere? And I just worry we can't see at our own backyard to, especially Chinese investments, and count on our ability to lecture about the danger of Chinese investments to carry the day.
I agree, and I think we all agree. We did meet the head of Southcom, we met the head of AFRICOM, both of whom told us that we're investing in Latin America and in Africa.
And just in Africa, a stat. Of the 35 youngest countries in the world, 32 are in Africa.
Well, and
so in terms of a youth bulge and a growing population, I mean, this is where the future is.
I think the population in Africa is going to double by 2050, and it will be the most populous continent, I think, in the world. I'm not positive that it will exceed China and India, but I think it will. And we're underinvesting. And in South America, for example, we heard that there are 5 countries with no ambassadors, no confirmed ambassadors. And our military footprint in Africa is decreasing. I think we all agree on this commission that investment has to improve. And again, our whole idea about all elements of national power has to include partners and allies in those regions. Not an afterthought, not to say, oh yeah, about Africa and South America. And on fentanyl, I believe that President Biden and President Xi, when they met in San Francisco, came up with some deal on China policing the precursors of fentanyl, which come into our country mostly, I think, through Mexico. That deal hasn't been fully implemented, but it's a start. And it's absolutely important, given how devastating fentanyl is to young people in this country who take drugs unsuspecting that they're laced with fentanyl. It's absolutely crucial as a national security threat to us that we do more.
Thank you. My time is up. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Tuberville, please.
Thank you very much. Following up on that, is our southern border a national threat? I've only seen it in your report one time.
Yes, absolutely. The border security is a threat. We do call in the report for additional funding across the agencies of national security, including DHS, which has the fundamental responsibility for the border.
Yeah, 80,000 Chinese coming across the border in the last 9 months. Is that a threat? That's a pretty good threat, isn't it?
It's a potential threat, so yes.
Huge. I don't understand why we're not talking about it more. Fentanyl, I saw a report the other day where you can order fentanyl from China and make it at your own house. You can order it, be delivered, and make millions of pills without any repercussion. I mean, we've lost our mind. We're losing our kids. You're talking about education. I spent 35 years in education, and your report mentions changing our military standards. Is that correct? to take more young men and women in the military?
Part of what you hear from the services when you talk about the recruitment challenges they face under Tuberville is that some of the standards are no longer really relevant, and some of it's an artifact of
such as
childhood asthma, for instance. You know, is that something
flat feet? You know, that's
yes.
A lot of people got out of Vietnam because of flat feet.
Yeah.
Right?
So
yeah.
so the question is, do you continue to use those standards, which are screening out people who might otherwise be willing and ready to serve, or do you change it? Some of it's a function of the changing tracking that we have in medical records that allow things that wouldn't have come up 10 or 15 years ago to block somebody from service, and that's, I think, what we were talking about.
Well, yeah, what's hurting us too is a lot of our government schools. I call them government schools because I went in thousands of them while I was coaching recruiting. And the problem we have is hate that's being taught in a lot of our government schools towards our country. Why would any young man or woman want to fight for a country that they don't believe in, that they're being taught to hate? It's absolutely amazing to me the direction this country's going. So is there any agreement there, Representative Harman? I mean,
yeah, there is agreement there.
Yeah.
I think hate on both sides is totally destructive. I think the absence of civics education and the absence of institutions that help people understand what patriotism means. We had a conversation about national service, which might be a way to get all of our youth back together. I mean, this country, sadly, is in a point where many people say our biggest enemy is us fighting each other. I was just going to talk about standards. One of the problems is the kind of deployments the military does, every 2 years moving somewhere, where in many cases the spouse works and having to change his or her job every 2 years is very burdensome. It's also hard on kids, and so that could change. And we talk about incorporating more of the tech base and the tech skills into the work that our military does. I mean, after all, future fights, we were just talking about this, are in more domains. They're in cyber and space, not just in air, land, and sea. And so if we don't have the skill sets to fight those wars, we're going to lose.
Yeah, because we don't have a middle class. We're ruining our middle class. We're technical schools. All these kids, we tell, hey, you got to go to a 4-year school to get a job. We all knew that when we grew up. That's what we were told. But now that's not true. A lot of these kids go to school and their way's paid, and unfortunately they get some kind of social justice degree, and they can't get a job at Walmart. We have got to start training our kids again. We're losing the ball here. I mean, this is where to me that's a national security threat where we don't teach kids how to use their hands and do those things. Let's go to Ukraine real quick. We got to get out of this, right? I mean, this has got to be solved. Do we let Ukraine into NATO? Your thoughts?
NATO has already made the decision back in 2008 that Ukraine at some point will be in NATO. And that's a decision that was taken under the George W. Bush administration, in which I served. I think the alliance, the just completed summit of the alliance, has made clear that while there's an ongoing conflict in Ukraine, it's probably not appropriate to have Ukraine be a member, but the alliance has undertaken a series of actions, and the U.S. bilaterally with Ukraine has undertaken a series of actions to build a bridge towards Ukraine's potential future
So with that
membership.
being said, should we allow, with the new government in Mexico join BRICS? Should we allow that? Because it's coming. It's coming.
Senator, I don't know that we have any ability to, the BRICS is an organization which the United States is not, a party to. So
I'm just asking your opinion, because we're doing the national defense strategy, and we're going to be looking down the barrel of a gun on this because they're going to be on our border. You just said that, NATO was going to accept Ukraine. Should Mexico go into BRICS if offered that position with the new president they have? The BRICS is actually kind of an invention of Goldman Sachs. It's not really a serious military organization of any As
sort.
we speak, it is coming though. With India joining, with Iran joining, Saudi Arabia joining, it could be a threat. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks very much, Senator Tuberville. Senator King, please.
Thank you.
The first country to adapt new technologies generally wins wars. Genghis Khan in the stirrup, the longbow at the Battle of Agincourt, the tank in World War I, radar in World War II. We are systematically missing technologies. It's one of the great failures of the last 10 or 15 years in our defense structure. Directed energy, hypersonics, AI, cyber, information warfare. We are woefully behind on every one of those. Directed energy. We're shooting down $20,000 Houthi missiles with $4.3 million missiles of our own. That's ridiculous. And the budget for directed energy in the Defense Department has fallen by half in the last 3 years. Representative Harman, is it systematic legacy thinking? What's the problem? Why did we miss these obvious technologies?
Well, you heard us say that the Pentagon is moving at the speed of bureaucracy. I think it is legacy systems, old think. I think Congress is somewhat...
I think it's legacy thinking.
Legacy thinking, fine. But I think that Congress is somewhat complicit in the way the budget process doesn't work, and this insistence on requirements and oversight rather than on what is the problem set we are solving for, which is how the tech sector thinks. I've been making a comment about DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit that was set up by the late Secretary Ash Carter, that maybe we should outsource the Pentagon to DIU, which is ably headed by someone named Doug Beck, who had 11 years experience in the private sector, because they know how to think about this. And I couldn't agree with you more. The budget of DIU is $1 billion out of $850 billion. Doug Beck says he can leverage that.
Technologies that win wars.
Right. I'm in violent agreement with you. He says he can leverage that into $50 billion of commercial investment, but that's still a pittance compared to the kind of change we need to undergo, not just at the Pentagon, but at the Pentagon lashed up with other government agencies, with the tech sector, and with partners and allies. That is our point about all elements of national power, which will win the next war.
Let's talk about cyber for a minute. I think it's kind of pathetic that today, just today, this morning, at the beginning of this meeting, we approved the very first Assistant Secretary of Defense for cyber. Cyber has been a serious threat in this country for 15 or 20 years, and just today we're finally getting there. To me, that's emblematic. Let me talk about another point about cyber. Several of our members and you all have talked about the cornerstone of our defense strategy is deterrence. In cyber, we have no deterrent strategy. We're trying to patch our way out of this. People have attacked our country, they've attacked our elections, they've attacked our infrastructure. There have been no consequences, no results. No one fears us in the cyber realm. Do you agree with me that we need to develop a cyber deterrent strategy? It doesn't necessarily have to be cyber for cyber, but there has to be a price to be paid for attacking this country in the realm of cyber. Mr. Ambassador?
Senator King, I think one of the challenges with deterrence in the cyber realm is that first, attribution is frequently a problem. But secondly, the actions you take are not necessarily visible, and therefore it lacks the kind of visible signs that we have in other
realms. It needs to be
realms.
Visible to the adversary or
to the adversary.
Deterrence.
Yeah. Well, the problem is it needs to be visible to the adversary, but the question is it visible to your allies who you are also trying to protect with your deterrent? I did want to, if you permit me, on the directed energy point, because I think it's a very powerful point that you make. I think directed energy has suffered a bit from over-promising in the past, and it's been the next big thing, and a lot of people have felt that it's not been delivered. But clearly what you identified is correct, which is we can't be on the wrong end of the cost imposition curve where adversaries can use very cheap attritables that we're shooting down with $1 million missiles. That's just not sustainable. But there is progress being made on directed energy, including by our allies. The UK has a system, Dragonfire, that looks like it's got some promise. The Israelis have got Iron Beam. So there's activity going on, and I think you're right that we need to invest more time and effort in it.
If I could just add one thing on cyber. I think you serve on the Intelligence Committee as well. There are things we're doing that we can't talk about that are deterring cyber against us. And we're in other networks, and
I'm sorry, but if you can't talk about it, it's not deterrence.
But
You've got to be able to talk
No,
about it. As
maybe,
Dr. Strangelove, you
but
can't
not
keep
all-
the doomsday machine
Not
secret.
all the time. Our adversaries do understand some of the things we're doing for deterrence. Attribution is still an evolving art, and we can't always identify who's doing what to us. But I think we're stronger in the cyber realm than may appear publicly.
I think we have capabilities. My time is up. I commend you for mentioning terrorism. I worry that we've turned our focus so much to great power competition. One demented individual almost upset our entire presidential process a few weeks ago. I think terrorism is still a very, very significant threat, and I'm afraid we are not attending to it sufficiently. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Cotton, please.
Representative Harman, Ambassador Edelman, and the rest of the commission, thank you for your good work once again. Ambassador Edelman, you spoke with Senator Fisher about the multiple theater force construct, basically the kind of threats we're planning for. And there's a time when this nation planned to fight 2 major wars at a time. And I think now we're down to a force that can fight 1 conflict and protect our homeland and hopefully scare bad guys everywhere else around the world and not starting a war. Is that right?
That is correct. That's what the 2022 NDS describes.
So that's what our National Defense Strategy says. Is the current force even capable of doing that, in your opinion? Putting aside what it should be capable of doing, which I'll come to momentarily, can it even do that?
I think there are very serious questions about whether the force in being could actually execute the strategy.
Okay. There's been some talk about this access of Russia and China and North Korea and Iran. You might add in a few other ancillary bad actors like Cuba, for instance. Do these countries have to get together in a secret diplomatic meeting and agree to carve up different parts of the world or to act in concert? Russia, you strike Ukraine. China, I'm going to hit Taiwan, and then Iran's going to go for the jugular in Israel. Do they have to get together like the Molotov-Ribbentrop summit and have a pact to act in concert together?
They could do that, but they don't necessarily have to do that. I mean, the problem we face is twofold. We face one problem that you've just described, which is concerted, collaboration in aggression. But there's also the potential of opportunistic aggression if something happens in one theater and one of the other actors decides to take advantage of it to do something in another theater.
Representative Harman, I see you nodding your head. Would you like to add your perspective?
I totally agree with that, and we see that all the time. And I'm not sure if you were in the room, but one of the things that Ambassador Edelman said is that China is watching intently whether Russia can get away with its illegal invasion of Ukraine. And if it can, that would empower China, without a conversation with Russia, to move against Taiwan.
And this idea, well founded in history, that these adversary nations don't have to sit down at a secret summit, that they can just see that, for instance, the United States and its allies are being taxed in Europe, and therefore now's the time to become more aggressive in the Middle East if you're Iran, or maybe China goes for the jugular in Taiwan. It gets back to the point about this force construct as well. What they also see is what the United States says it's capable of doing, and the fact that it may not even be capable of doing that. Is that right?
I agree.
Yeah.
And the word pivot probably should be retired. I don't think we can leave anywhere. I think we have to have an understanding of the threats against us, not just against regions, everywhere. And the whole idea of this multiple force construct is flexibility and having an adequate deterrence so we don't engage in more wars.
Another related point, there's been some questions about the information environment, misinformation, disinformation, cyber threats as well. Those are important, don't get me wrong. But are wars going to be won in the information environment and cyber without things that go boom in the real world, Ambassador Edelman?
You have to have both. I mean, I don't think you were in the room, Senator Cotton. I said that our adversaries, particularly the Russians, who've written a lot about this doctrinally, see information as part of a suite of activities, including all of their kinetic activities, whereas we see it in sort of silos. But they see it totally differently, and you have to be able to, bring all of those elements together in war.
We've learned a lot, and we've technologically seen advances on the battlefield in Ukraine on both sides. But isn't it the case that the most important technological advances are the advances that enhance the power of the things that go boom on the battlefield, the munitions, the aircraft, the drones, the interceptors, and so forth, not things that are just done from keyboards sitting back in Washington?
I want to be careful, because I think part of the answer is that some of what we've done, for instance, in arming the Ukrainians with different off-the-shelf commercial drones, has been undone by Russian electronic warfare, which is done from a keyboard. So, and electronic warfare is sometimes attributed to information warfare as well. So I think it's
keyboards closer to the battlefield with big dishes that shoot invisible things up into the sky, right?
Exactly.
Not just people sitting at a keyboard writing a hashtag.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you both. My time's expired.
Thank you very much, Senator Cotton. Senator Manchin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you all for very informative discussions this morning. I appreciate all the hard work you've done. When I first came to the Senate in 2010, I came leaving the governor's office of West Virginia and wasn't really that much in tune on the national threats that we had. I was worried about the threats we had in West Virginia. So when I came here, I tried to bone up when I was on this committee, my first committee. And I'll never forget, and it had to be early February or late January of 2011, we had all the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all the questions were being asked and identifying the problems we had around the world and the threats we had. And the question was asked to Admiral Mullins, Mike Mullins at that time, what's the greatest threat the United States faces? I thought I'm going to hear about, learning about China more and about Russia and always being Russia and the threat that they have. And then all of a sudden, without hesitating, he said, the debt of our nation is the greatest threat that we face as Americans. So I would ask you all, since we just hit $35 trillion of debt yesterday, what do you all believe is the greatest threat we face? Jane?
Well, let me agree with you that our hemorrhaging debt is a huge threat. And one of the things
I was even talking about either of national
we
Democrat,
do.
Republicans, nobody.
Senator, we do in this report. We identify the national debt as a national security threat. And we say that we need to spend smarter and spend more on defense and pay for it. We, on a unanimous basis, are not recommending printing more money. We are recommending finding a way to raise the revenues and reform entitlements. I know that's a sacred cow, sadly, these days, but reform entitlements. And we point out that the interest on the debt is larger than our defense budget.
So you both agree to that?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay. Second, I will say that on your report, you talked about the current force structure that we have, and I think you had identified that the Marines are only ones meeting that. We agree with that. What you failed to do is basically identify why we have not, or why you all did not take up women being in selective service or joining selective service, because women make up 74% of healthcare and education industry, 52% of financial activities. They're a tremendously strong force, and there's a lot of women I don't want to go up against, I can tell you that, in so many ways. But why do you believe, I guess my question is simple, does the commission support women registering for selective service?
Well, I'll speak for myself. I do. I think that women are a majority of our population, a majority of the talent pool. Many of the most talented women serve on this committee. So yes, they should be. We should be. And
I'll make it clear that it does not. We talked about does not require women to participate in military draft.
I understand.
Which also require
it's registering.
Yeah, registering.
Yes,
that's all.
And my answer to that is yes.
How come y'all didn't address it?
I don't have a good answer for you, Senator Manchin. It's not something we took up. We looked at other elements of the recruiting challenges that that the services face.
I got you. Well, I hope you all would visit that, if you will. So I have two more questions. My next question would be Russia. What have we learned about Russia during the Ukraine war? Do you think it's basically shown Russia's vulnerability, or they've learned basically where their vulnerabilities were, strengthened? What's your concerns?
I think we've learned a lot of things. I mean, at first, I think we've learned that corruption is a feature, not a bug, of the system that Vladimir Putin has created since he became president of Russia. at the turn of the century. I think we've learned that Russian military doctrine is not necessarily going to predict how they actually will fight when a conflict comes up. I think we've learned that we've relearned a lesson that has been true of Russian military history for hundreds of years, which is they're willing to sacrifice the lives of their service folks to gain an objective without regard, to the human costs.
My final question, if I could, real quickly. I commend your report on attention to defense industrial base, especially munitions and supply chain. However, there was no mention of solid rocket motors. We have a problem. And the problem is this: we continue to keep pouring money into Aerojet Rocketdyne that continually falls short of producing the quality of rockets in the amount we need, but the government is into that, supporting it. And yet the federal government, we own the ABL lab at Rocket City in West Virginia, and they have been producing unbelievable, and no one's saying a word about it. No one's basically pushing. Why are you shoving money into a private entity when the board changes? Who's buying stock ownership when you already own one? Have you all looked at that, or would you, and basically bring it to a higher level?
Sure, absolutely. And you'll be missed here. You have been very articulate at identifying things, not just that West Virginia does, but the energy needs of this country and why it matters that we export more energy.
If you would look into it and compare ABL at Rocket City in West Virginia, versus Aerojet Rocketdyne, and look at the ownership, the production, the quality of what we're producing there, because without that, as we've said before, we can't compete. We just can't. So if you would do that, I would appreciate it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. Senator Ernst, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both so much for being here, for your leadership, and to the entire commission for their great work and support staff as well. We really do appreciate it. Of course, we've had the opportunity to hear about this urgent assessment of our national security landscape, and it has changed quite dramatically since the last NDS. So thank you for your time and attention. The recommendation should be a roadmap to address our security challenges and restore American leadership on the world stage. I feel that's very important. It's desperately needed right now. And I know we have talked about force structure, and Ambassador, we'll start with you. Only recently has the force planning shifted to a single conflict structure, despite facing the most significant strategic competition our country has ever faced. So the report, I want to draw attention to the quote, and again, I know we've talked about it, but the report includes a quote from a defense strategist who warns, quote, "A force that can only wage one conflict is effectively a zero conflict force, since employing it would require the president to preclude any other meaningful global engagement," end quote. And in light of this, again, if you can talk a little bit about the multi-theater force construct, Ambassador, but then I also want to then lead into what Senator King alluded to with terrorism. Where does that leave our counterterrorism forces?
Senator Ernst, I think the problem we have is that, to go to your point, if we have a force that's optimized to fight one war, when a crisis erupts and the president asks the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs for military options to deal with it, the answer they're likely to get is, Mr. or Madam President, we can fight this fight, but you will be at very high risk in all these other places. And against that backdrop, what kind of decisions would, come out of that? And it's why I think it's described as a zero war force. Our view was that you have to be able to deter and potentially defeat adversaries in all three of the main theaters that we have been engaged in since the end of the Second World War. and which we repeatedly engaged in. I mean, there's been no shortage of efforts to try and extricate the United States from the Middle East. The last NDS in 2018 said we should be willing to run risk in the Middle East. I think on October 7th, we got a sense, and then again on April 13th, of what running additional risk means in the Middle East. So it's our view that we have to be able to, manage to do all of those things. And in that regard, I think we're consistent with our colleagues on the Strategic Posture Commission who argued something quite similar. But we also have to be able to deal with the ongoing threat, as Senator King said, of terrorism, and to be able to continue to focus on the things that Special Operations Command has been focused on for a number of years, making sure that we don't have terrorists plotting to, create mass casualties either in the homeland or, with our allies.
Yes. If I could just add to that, I was in Congress on 9/11. Many were. I was a member before that of a commission on I think the Commission on Terrorism, which predicted a major attack on U.S. soil. No one was listening. And then came 9/11, and we surged everything to the GWAT, the Global War on Terror. Surging everything is not a good strategy. We missed, when we did that, the rise of China, we missed the rise of Russian grievance, we missed the kind of world we now live in. We have to do all these things at the same time, walk and chew gum at the same time. And this report tries, by promoting this all elements of national power strategy, to talk about how we could do that. And we don't think, we, the Commission, on a unanimous basis, that accepting risk in certain parts of the world, basically meaning not projecting U.S. leadership, is a successful strategy. We have to be strong everywhere, which doesn't mean we have to have boots on the ground everywhere, but we have to have an all elements of national power strategy everywhere.
Yeah, I am in absolute agreement, Representative Harman. And mentioning SOCOM, Special Operations Command, I do think it's incredibly important. And I'm in full agreement that we need to be able to face multiple fronts. I think all of us on this committee would agree with that. But we also have to have those that are nimble, agile, those that can respond quickly to situations. Those forces are found in SOCOM. We need to be able to leverage different tools of power in other regions to create stability. So whether it's kinetic action through the military or just working with friends and allies, we need to create greater stability all around the world. And I think we can achieve that, but we have to be willing to invest.
And diplomacy is one of our tools. So it's soft power matters, but hard power does too. And we're not talking about selecting parts of the world for one and other parts for the other. We're talking about a combination that's greater than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I want to thank you both for your service and our entire commission and support staff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Ernst. Senator Gillibrand, please.
Thank you, Congresswoman Harman. Thank you, Ambassador Edelman. So grateful for your testimony, and thank you for the great work of this report. One of the things that you concluded was that the DoD should invest more in cyber capabilities and capacity. Over the last 2 NDAA cycles, we included a cyber academy to create an ROTC type program. There's about 600 schools eligible right now across the country who are already participating in this program. It's built on an NSA, much smaller program. Can you talk a little bit about how this cyber academy and its 1,000 slots a year could help meet DoD's future needs?
I don't doubt that it will help, fill the gap, because we need more cyber warriors. I do think that Cyber Command has actually done a pretty good job, Cyber Command and NSA under General Nakasone's leadership and now his successor, at building the force, which, when we looked at this from the commission point of view 6 years ago, there were questions about how well we were doing. I think we've actually made a lot of progress in the ensuing years. But obviously, the more we can generate young cyber warriors who are willing to come to work for the government, because that's been an issue in the past, that is going to be a boon.
I would just add that and I'm not sure you were here when we talked about it, that the two new defense domains are space and cyber. And we now have Space Force and we have Cyber Command, and slowly we are building the skill sets that we need for our defense capability, not just in the Pentagon, to be robust and effective. And so a major cyber attack on U.S. soil could presage China's annexation of Taiwan. That's something we mentioned before. That could happen. Is the American public aware of this and ready? Absolutely not. Is there Chinese technology all over America, including in our ports? Absolutely. And so building more capable people who have the training and having a more focused government on the threats are both essential things to do.
So one of the concerns I have is that the current recruiting technique for cybercom and cyberforce is that they're recruiting from the existing services. So Navy has to give X number every year, Army, Marines, etc., Air Force, and not all the services can meet the goals. Not all the services have the senior cyber personnel that a Cyber Command actually needs and wants. And when they do leave to Cyber Command, then there's no cyber expert left in the service because they just gave those personnel to Cyber Command. So one question I have for space as well, shouldn't we consider having a West Point for cyber or a West Point for space, or having one new service academy to educate and train the military personnel for Cyber Command and Space Command? And the reason I say this is because the cyber academy that we have created is just civilian jobs, because 50% of all cyber jobs are civilian. So let's at least recruit from the entire country in an ROTC type program for non-military personnel. And so that arguably can be 1,000 kids a year graduating with that capability. So let me push the next question. 1,000 of civilian personnel is great, not going to meet all our needs. Do you think we should think about, or at least do a study on the importance of perhaps having a service academy to directly train military personnel and commanders in cyber and space?
It's not something we examine, Senator Gillibrand, but I certainly think it's something worth some study to see whether that would generate the kind of flow through that you would want to staff those skill sets, as my colleague just said.
And we also talk about integrating the tech base with the DoD base, and make a recommendation that the business model of the tech base may be much more successful than the business model, government at the pace of bureaucracy of the Pentagon. And the tech base produces a lot of highly trained cyber folks through our national university system and private universities. So I think the study is still a good idea, but I also think there are resources we're not leveraging that we could.
So even a more serious question, you conclude that given that much of the critical infrastructure that the United States relies on for the power projection overseas falls outside of the DoD's remit, the department needs to further its integration with and increase the capability of the other parts of the U.S. government, including DHS and CISA, intelligence community, FBI, and state and local governments. This finding I find to be the most troubling because it's entirely outside the DoD's mission, it's outside their authority, it's outside the job they want, the job they're willing to do. But in actuality, we don't therefore have domestic cyber defense. FBI is the best cyber response organization to the globe. CISA can literally only offer best practices, and their best practices are the best practices, and they're doing great outreach and all the things. But there's no one to stop, and this goes to Senator Angus King's questions. There's no one to stop a significant cyber attack, let's just say on military bases, taking out all of our capabilities domestically to have an electric grid, a water supply, food supply, emergency services, stock exchanges. There's no one to stop that, as if we'd want that in a war scenario. And we stop a bombing that's going to happen on our subway system, but we don't stop a cyber attack that's about to hit on our subway system. We'll do response, we do offensive. So with the 0 seconds I have left, could you please talk a little bit about what we should be doing from a cyber defense for the homeland. This year's NDA has a requirement for a plan for how to protect at least our military bases, but I think we should be protecting all of critical infrastructure.
Look, I agree, and I think the department is just beginning to wrap its arms around this problem. That as I'm not sure if you were in the room, Senator Gillibrand, when we said earlier, the homeland, if there's a conflict, is not going to be a sanctuary anymore, and the first attacks will likely be in the cyber domain, and they will be incredibly disabling for our society, but also for the department. But getting all the agencies of government that would have a role in all this, because it goes beyond just DOD, it goes beyond just DHS. I mean, it goes to the Department of Transportation, it goes to Commerce. I mean, there's just, it's an unbelievably complex issue, and we're only, I think, now kind of wrapping our minds around it, and it needs a lot more work and attention from the department.
I think that Senator King mentioned that this committee just confirmed an Assistant Secretary of Defense for cyber today. It's way too late. It's way too slow. You're absolutely right that all of this stuff has to be accelerated. I do think some of our capabilities that we can't talk about publicly are more extensive than people may believe, but the public is essentially clueless about the massive cyber attacks that could be launched any day by our adversaries, not just nation states, but rogue actors as well.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. Senator Smith, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your work, both of you. I want to ask a few questions about sort of this, our pivot to China, which I think, in this place, in this town, there's hard to find bipartisan agreement on much. I think most people agree that China is our, however you want to call it, chief adversary, pacing threat, pacing challenge, however you want to wordsmith it. I think that's real. And I think there's recognition, I think in your work and others, that we have a capacity problem in effectively doing that. So I wanted to ask maybe Dr. Edelman, as relates to this, sort of like priorities. How would you, I guess for either one of you, what would you say? I mean, I think I have an idea of what the number is. The amount of money that we spend in Europe. How much of our defense budget? Give me a ballpark of a dollar amount.
Senator Schmidt, it's a little hard to disaggregate it because, you've got command and control that, covers a variety of sins. But if you're getting at the question of, do we need to spend less on defense of Europe and more in the Indo-Pacific, I think we've got to be able to do both.
Here's this point. We're not doing both. And my argument isn't the withdrawal necessarily. My argument is, some estimates would be 150 billion to 300 billion a year. Let's just use that as a number, and people could debate what that actually is. I think for me, and I want to get your thoughts on this, if Canada and Europe went so they're a combined total of 2% right now. If they went to 3.4% of spending on defense as it relates to their GDP like we do, that's another $300 billion. And I'm just, have you guys grappled with this? Because to me, $300 billion allows us to, continue to be, an important ally for our European allies, but also allows us to do the things that we need to do for the homeland in China. So how do you guys view that?
I think, look, our allies need to spend more on defense. That's clear. At the latest NATO summit, there's clearly a lot of talk of allies moving beyond 2% of GDP, which now I think about 2/3 of them are hitting, to beyond 2% to 2.5%. I think, honestly, a sine qua non of them doing that is also seeing us make the investment, which is why in increasing our top line, which is one of the reasons we came to the conclusions we did about the U.S. Top line. Obviously, we need our allies to be producing more. Our defense industrial base is in very bad shape, as we've discussed in our report. The European defense industrial base is in even worse shape.
Yeah.
So we need, their industrial base, we need our industrial base, we need our allies in the Indo-Pacific, Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, Taiwan, all need to be stepping up, because to match what Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are doing is going to be beyond our ability to do it ourselves. We're going to have to do it, with allies. So there's going to have to be broad investment across all of the regions. And by the way, Middle East as well. We've got, partners in the Middle East who could also be doing more in that regard.
I would just add that I think Europe is waking up to this, and I think there's a robust conversation in Europe about doing more, and even possibly setting up. I don't think this idea will ever become a reality, some kind of a European force. But the point is, spending more, leading more, fighting Europe's fight in Europe, and I would add that we embrace in this all elements of national power strategy that's the core of our report, doing more with partners and allies. Think about the Indo-Pacific. The Secretary of Defense is there now, I think, with Secretary Blinken, talking about how to enhance the command that we have in Japan into a more robust command. It shouldn't just be...
I have limited time. I want to get to one more question.
Okay.
So I appreciate, I think that's true. I think that $300 billion would go a long way in allowing us to sort of, as we talk about priorities, and just to run through a couple, $320 million for the Gaza pier would have gone a long way and almost fully funded, the Guam Missile Defense Project that we're not spending money on. So there, you could go through this list about things of us being spread too thin and missing what our real priorities are. And I don't have time to go through them all, but they're significant. I guess the final question of the time that I have is this question of the industrial base. I mean, to me, there's no question Europe needs to step up, and that's the part of a lot of conversations we have here. But as it relates to our industrial base, I supported the plus up. I think we should be spending more. If there's a couple of things that could be done to actually produce the things that we need, we don't have enough of what we need. What are a couple of those top line suggestions that you would have, that when people ask me back home, when I talk about this challenge, what are the things that can be done differently?
Well, I mean, members of this committee have done, their job for sure in providing, for instance, authority for multi-year procurement, which is, I think, one of the most important things, because industry responds to, the notion that they're going to have a, long timeline to produce this, not just a spike and then go down. It would be helpful if the appropriators would on their side make sure their dollars appropriated against that to do that for the department. That I know is one of the problems that's held up the department until recently.
I just add that we're not only talking about the defense industrial base, we're talking about the industrial base and embracing fully the tech sector, which has much more to contribute to the defense of our country than it is able to contribute.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Schmidt. I want to thank Representative Harman and Ambassador Edelman for their excellent testimony based on a superb report. And I also want to shout out to General Keane and Tom Mankin, Mara Rudman, Mariah Sixkilla, Elisa Sarzak, and Roger Zakheim, the great group. But I have to give a special kudos to David Grannis, Ralph Cohen, Amy Hopkins, Travis Shaw, Dustin Walker, and Becca Wassa, because we all know you get the credit, they did the work. So thank you very much. But this has been an extraordinarily useful hearing, and it's got us both informed and I think energized to move forward. And with that, I thank you all, and I will adjourn the hearing.